Well, there are various reasons for this. First of all, it serves to provide the individual with a specific identity. If someone says to you, "Who are you?" in many cases, the first response is going to be, "I'm an American." Okay? So it serves as an important focus of an individual's identity. It sort of tells them who they are. In addition, it connects specific freedoms with particular institutions. So that, for example, if someone's an American, they may say, well, I have freedom of speech, it's guaranteed by the Constitution. If you're an Australian or if you live in the UK, you don't. You don't have that kind of guarantee of freedom. You have other freedoms, or in a sense, things are carved up in different sorts of ways. But what conservatives will say is, well, nations and so on are important because of the way in which they define our characters, because of the way in which they define our freedoms and the sort of space in which they're living. In addition, the nation is important because shared nationality brings with it obligations to other citizens, including to contribute to their welfare through taxation if they fall on hard times from a conservative perspective, and also an obligation to defend your country and, if necessary, to die for it. And indeed, it's quite interesting in this respect that there's quite a contrast between the liberal tradition, which puts the individual at the centre of things, and that aspect of the conservative tradition, which sees, in a sense, one's commitment to the nation of which one is a member as being a higher commitment which has got a genuine call on you for such purposes. In addition, some conservatives may see society as functioning like an organism in which each person must play their different roles properly if the whole is to flourish. It's a little bit like the idea that the body will only work properly if the eyes do what they're supposed to be doing, the ears do what they're supposed to be doing, and so on and so on. Some critics of conservatism might say at this point, well, yes, okay, but surely one important question in terms of the analogy of the body is who gets to be the stomach? I mean, basically, who gets to do the enjoyment of the food and so on, and who has to go out and do the work? So there's room for, but you can see it's an image which appeals to some conservatives, though gives rise to a bit of controversy. What, one might ask, about conservatism and markets and economics and so on? Here, it seems to me, in a rather interesting way, conservative reactions have been mixed. On the one side, conservatives have typically favoured markets because on the one side they offer the prospects of prosperity and foster individual self-reliance. I mean, there's a lot about a market-based society that appeals. In addition, there seem to many conservatives to be something rather nice about a market-based society because it doesn't have central control, because you don't have, as it were, an all-powerful government running everything and running the details of people's lives. At the same time, conservatives have also exhibited various worries about markets. Why? Well, they may have, first of all, an adverse impact on tradition and community and the social fabric. I mean, there's a sense in which, if you have a market-based society, there may be all kinds of social change, which upset and change the circumstances in which people are living, that life, in a way, in a sense, may have seemed to make sense on a particular kind of basis for people. And then when things change, well, people may or may not be able to get employment afterwards, but they may not be able to get employment in the same kind of conditions. And there's a sense in which you may lose out on some notions of community, on some notions of identity as tied into an employment within such a society. Also, there's a concern on the part of conservatives that markets and a market-based society may create wealth without any corresponding responsibility. And consider in this context the way in which, for example, some people working in merchant banks may have been able to make unbelievable amounts of money. Now, the Conservatives, I guess, would say they have nothing against that as such, but they might say, look, contrast those youngsters often who are making enormous amounts of money with people who have had more established positions in the community, perhaps landowners and whatever, who may equally have been wealthy, but who had behind them a tradition of how to behave with regard to their wealth, a tradition of giving, a tradition of helping people out, as opposed to youngsters just getting a whole lot of money and, in a sense, not really knowing quite what to do with it. You get a concern also that markets in a market-based society may foster a kind of selfishness, the sort of me generation stuff, and also a kind of rootless individualism, people who move around to get one job or another, and in a way don't really belong anywhere at all. And the worry here is that one may end up with individuals who, in a sense, are culturally impoverished. I don't mean by this that they haven't read Shakespeare or something, but in a sense they're people who don't really belong anywhere, who've got no roots, who've got no real participation in a particular local culture and its attachments and the kind of obligations that it brings to other people. Now you might say, this is all very well, but just what does it have to do with conservatism as we know it today? And indeed, what does it have to do with the range of different kinds of conservatism to which I referred at the start of the lecture? Because there is surely a discontinuity between the kind of thing that I've been talking about, which in a way is quite clear-cut, and the kinds of attitudes and the kind of views that people may have today when they describe themselves as conservatives. And indeed, it's exactly this difference and what the connections are which will be our concern in the next lecture. Let me now turn just to recapitulate what has been covered in this lecture and what its significance is. First of all, I stressed at the outset the diversity of contemporary conservatism. The way in which if someone is a conservative, there's a sense in which one has to ask a little bit more, well, what kind of a conservative really to get a feel for what they're up to. Second, I talked a little bit about the origins of conservatism, in which I stressed largely British conservatism, but also stressed the contribution that was made by resistance to moves to modernize the state in, for example, 18th century France. I then talked about ideals. As I mentioned when I was introducing this notion, to talk about ideals in connection with conservatism is to talk about something that in a way is a little strange, because conservatives typically don't put up abstract ideals in the kind of way in which liberals might do or libertarians might do. But we were able to discern a range of ideals to which one could say conservatives are committed. And if one looks forward to conservatism today, it's particularly important in this context to bear in mind the significant role that's given to morality and to the notion that the state shouldn't be neutral between good and evil. That if some ideas are correct, if some ideas are useful in terms of how society functions, why should the state be neutral? Why should the state be neutral between virtue and vice? We also talked about programs. And again, in talking about programs in relation to traditional conservatism, it's a slight element of unease. But there were, in this context, certain things which are highly significant. There was this notion of a kind of interplay between the personality and institutions. The way in which, from the conservatives' perspective, inherited institutions were valuable because they, as it were, served the test of time, because we were used to them, but also because of the way in which people were socialized into them. This, on the one side, empowering people, enabling them, in a sense, to do certain kinds of things very well with certain sorts of institutions, but on the other, as posing certain kinds of problems. For example, if you wish to move institutions from one country to another country. And in that context, I referred to the fact that the conservative, in this sense, wouldn't be at all surprised that the attempt to set up liberal democracy quickly in the Soviet Union wasn't too successful. I also, in this context, referred to the way in which conservatives' attitudes towards markets and the economy are somewhat ambivalent. Typically, conservatives historically weren't sort of gung-ho enthusiasts for the market. Why? Just because they were conscious of the way in which changes in institutions and changes in people's personalities might serve to have dramatic effects upon how people functioned. All this leads us into looking at conservatism today, which we'll do next time. Thank you.